I never revealed to my son what I had concealed inside the grandfather clock at the rear of my repair shop. When he wed a woman who viewed my life's work as little more than a figure on a financial statement, I ensured every action she took was carefully recorded. One afternoon, my shop assistant phoned me from the rear area, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Calloway, you need to come see this. Your daughter-in-law is in here and she's searching through your desk." I had been anticipating this moment for 18 months, and everything I had discreetly arranged was about to alter the course of my family forever. I'm thankful you're here with me. Before I describe what occurred that afternoon, leave a comment that says the word protect. If you believe genuine love sometimes means safeguarding the people you cherish from the darkest side of themselves, there is a specific kind of silence that descends over a watch repair shop once the final customer departs. It isn't the silence of vacancy. It's more like the silence of a breath being held. Every item on those shelves is waiting for someone's touch, waiting for its role. I've devoted 38 years to learning to distinguish between a clock that has merely halted and one that is failing. The noises are not alike. My name is Arthur Calloway. I'm 64 years old, and most folks in Asheville, North Carolina recognize me as the fellow on Lexington Avenue who can revive a timepiece from the brink. Calloway Clock and Watch Repair has occupied this same location since 1989. The structure itself is slender, brick-fronted, with a hand-painted window sign my wife created herself the year we launched. Miriam used gold leaf and a delicate brush she'd requested from an art supply catalog. She spent 3 days on those letters. I've never altered them. Inside, the walls contain more than stock. They contain memories. Pocket watches with fractured crystals. Mantel clocks with twisted chimes. Wristwatches delivered by grandchildren whose grandparents have passed, but who wish the items still functioning. Every item reveals something to me. Every worn cog, every stripped knob, every spring too exhausted to maintain tension any longer. People believe I repair clocks. What I truly do is refuse to allow time to halt for the things that count. My workspace is in the rear of the store, divided from the front by a low wooden counter and a doorway draped with a bead curtain Miriam purchased at a craft fair in 1994. She said it added personality to the place. I said it made me feel like I was entering a fortune teller's booth every time I headed to work. She laughed about that for roughly a week. Miriam passed away 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer, stage 4. Found in October and gone by February. The quickest and most crushing 5 months of my life. She was 57 years old. She had intentions for 60. She left me numerous things when she departed. She left me the shop, the lease, the customer records spanning 2 decades. She left me her gold leaf paintbrush, still enclosed in a cloth in the top drawer of her desk. She left me our son, Daniel, who was 26 at the time and already starting to develop into a man she'd be proud of. And she left me a clock, not just any clock, a bracket clock, English, around 1880, with a fruitwood casing and a brass face that still displays every hour in Roman numerals exactly as the creator planned. She'd acquired it at an estate sale the year before she fell ill. She dedicated 3 weekends to restoring it herself, which was uncommon for her. She was a bookkeeper by profession, not a clockmaker. But she wanted to learn, she said. She wanted to grasp what I cherished about the trade. 2 days before she entered the hospital for the final time, she brought the clock from the house to the shop and placed it on the shelf over my workbench. She offered no explanation. She simply gazed at me with those steady gray eyes she possessed and said, "Arthur, this one remains here, and when the moment arrives, you'll understand what to do with it." I assumed she was disoriented. The morphine had been rising. I smiled and assured her I'd guard it well. I did not comprehend her meaning for quite some time. Daniel was a fine boy. I want to state that clearly, without reservation, because everything that comes next grows complex, and I don't want you to overlook that fact amid the complexity. He was a fine boy who grew into a fine man, truthful, diligent, the sort of individual who holds doors and recalls names and appears when you require him. He works as a structural engineer for a company in Asheville. He is precise with figures and precise with individuals, which are two separate abilities, and he possessed both. After Miriam died, he drove over every Sunday. We shared breakfast together. He assisted me with deliveries when my back troubled me. He never inquired about the will, never brought up finances. He simply appeared. I believed I had done something correctly. In the spring, 3 years ago, Daniel encountered a woman named Courtney Baines at a work gathering. She was 31, polished in appearance, employed in real estate development. Daniel brought her to the shop on a Saturday in April, proud in the manner fresh love renders young men proud, as if they've uncovered something the rest of the world overlooked. She was appealing in a calculated manner, the type of composed look that demands genuine effort to appear natural. She shook my hand with both of hers and remarked that the shop was utterly delightful. I thanked her. I observed her eyes scanning the space. She wasn't noticing delight, she was calculating. I identified it because I had witnessed that expression previously. Estate sale evaluators have it. Lawyers managing probate have it. It's the expression of someone who has already divided a space into columns before they discover its contents. I observed it, and I set it aside because I wished to be mistaken. I wished to be the wary older man who simply needed to offer others an opportunity. They became engaged in December, married the next September. It was a lovely ceremony at a vineyard beyond town. Daniel wept when he saw her walk down the aisle. I wept as well, because Miriam ought to have been present to witness it. For the initial few months, I convinced myself I had been mistaken. Courtney appeared to bring Daniel joy. She was methodical and ambitious and outgoing in the manner that naturally reserved individuals like my son require someone to be. She encouraged him in the ways a companion ought to. Then, in February, roughly 5 months into the marriage, matters changed. It began with inquiries, informal ones initially. How long had I possessed the structure? What were real estate values doing on Lexington? Had I explored any of those SBA retirement options for small business proprietors? She inquired in the way people do when they already possess the responses and are probing to see what you'll disclose. I replied cautiously. I said the building had served us well. I said I hadn't considered selling. I said Miriam and I had always intended to transfer the business to Daniel someday if he desired it. Courtney smiled. Of course, she said. That's so touching. The word touching, when applied to a 38-year strategy, is not praise. By March, Daniel began appearing altered on our Sunday mornings. More reserved, a bit preoccupied. He'd check his phone more often than before. Once I asked him if all was well, and he replied, "Yes, just exhausted." The second time I asked, 2 weeks afterward, he said Courtney believed he was laboring too many hours and she wished them to employ his weekends more purposefully. More purposefully? I said. You know, he said, avoiding my gaze. Like organizing things, events, maximizing free time. I grasped what he wasn't expressing. She was drawing him nearer to her and farther from me, one Sunday at a time. The visits grew less regular. Then they became infrequent. Then they ceased entirely and were substituted with messages, which are not equivalent, and both of us recognized it. In April, my shop assistant, a woman named Gloria Simmons, who has managed the front counter for 11 years, drew me aside on a Tuesday afternoon. "Mr. Calloway," she said, which is how she addresses me when matters are grave. "Your daughter-in-law stopped by yesterday while you were at the parts supplier. I informed her you weren't present. She said she merely wanted to browse for old time's sake." Gloria hesitated. She went to the rear area. "How long was she back there?" About 12 minutes. I walked to the back. Nothing seemed out of place, but I know that shop the way you know your own palms. The invoice container was slightly misaligned. The file drawer was half an inch more extended than I positioned it. Someone had examined the documents. I said nothing to Daniel. Not yet. I lacked sufficient proof. What I did the following week was contact a private investigator. His name is Marcus Webb, former Buncombe County Sheriff's deputy, now operating independently from an office on Merriman Avenue. A customer had suggested him 2 years earlier during a conflict over an estate item, and I had retained his card in the rear of my ledger. I phoned him on a Wednesday afternoon and requested he meet me at the shop after hours. Marcus is systematic and understated, which is what you seek in a man performing this sort of task. He sat opposite my workbench, listened to all I described without interjecting, and posed precisely 4 questions when I concluded. What was the address of the property? Did my son have separate access to my financial accounts? Had Courtney made any straightforward requests about the will? And did I have legal counsel? I responded, the shop address. No, not yet straightforward. And yes, Robert Ashford, who had been my lawyer for 19 years and had managed the estate arrangements after Miriam died. Good, Marcus said. He'd commence monitoring the following Monday. That same week I contacted Robert. I described what I'd observed. He revised my will that same month and reorganized the trust so that the property and accounts would transfer under conditions, not automatically. He also recommended I start maintaining written notes of every unusual discussion. I told him I already was. I purchased a small notebook, dark green, from the stationery shop on Wall Street. I dated the first entry April 14th and wrote 3 sentences. I have maintained a record every week since. What Marcus discovered over the next 2 months was not unexpected, but it was detailed enough to be valuable. Courtney had met 3 times with a real estate lawyer named Paige Hensley, who focused on commercial property deals. The meetings had occurred at a cafe downtown, not at a legal office, which indicated she was cautious about records. Marcus also recorded 2 phone conversations captured through lawful methods from outside in which Courtney was overheard talking about the Lexington property and the estate schedule with an individual whose voice he had not yet recognized. In June, I witnessed the timeline remark myself. I had driven to Daniel and Courtney's home without warning, something I hadn't done previously, but I'd been invited for a barbecue and arrived 40 minutes early. Daniel was in the backyard. I came around the side gate and heard Courtney inside on the phone. The kitchen window was open because it was warm. I wasn't attempting to eavesdrop, but I heard distinctly. I don't know how much longer we're discussing, Paige. He's 64 and he's on blood pressure medication and he labors alone in a basement every day. I'm not being gloomy. I'm being practical. At some point, this property becomes a choice. A pause. Yes. Daniel is aware we need to consider the future. He just needs more time to adjust. I stood on the other side of that gate for about 30 seconds. Then I returned to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and phoned Marcus. I provided him the name Paige Hensley. I described what I'd overheard. I told him I required proof. He obtained it within 2 weeks. Paige Hensley had already prepared a preliminary plan for the sale of the Lexington Avenue building dependent upon a shift in ownership. The plan listed Courtney Calloway as the transitional contact. My son's name was absent from it. I want to pause here and share something I have not shared with anyone except Marcus and Robert and Gloria. The night I reviewed that plan, I sat in the rear of my shop for 3 hours with the lights extinguished, not because I was shattered, though I was, but because I was reflecting on Miriam, about what she understood and when she understood it, about that bracket clock she transported in from the house and positioned above my bench without clarification. I rose and examined it in the darkness. Fruitwood case, brass dial, Miriam's meticulous restoration on the mechanism, which I had inspected once years earlier out of interest and sealed again. I had not opened the casing since she passed. That night, I opened it. The mechanism was tidy, as I anticipated, but the casing itself, the base of the casing beneath the mechanism board, had a concealed bottom. Miriam had constructed it herself with a section of fitted walnut veneer and two small brass fasteners that released when pressed together. Inside, folded into a square and sealed in a plastic covering, was a letter in Miriam's handwriting. I will not reveal every word of what she composed. Some of it is between her and me and no one else. But the section that counts, the section that altered everything that came after, stated this. She had noticed the initial indications of Courtney's drive at the engagement dinner before the wedding. She had conducted some discreet investigation of her own, spoken to a few individuals, posed some subtle questions, observed closely. She could not be sure, she wrote, but she was worried and she wanted me to be ready. She had left records of her own discoveries in the bottom of the casing, account numbers, a name, a property deal from 4 years earlier in which Courtney had participated and which had concluded in a legal conflict over estate access. And then she wrote, "Arthur, you mend broken items. That's the talent God granted you. But some things aren't broken yet. They're just heading astray. Watch for the indicators. Safeguard what we constructed. And when the moment arrives, you'll understand what to do." I sat with that letter for a long while. Miriam had been observing. She had been readying. She had left me a resource inside a clock she restored with her own hands and positioned above my workbench 8 years before I required it. She had trusted that I would discover it when I was prepared. I removed everything from that concealed bottom and incorporated it into the proof I was assembling. Then I folded the letter carefully, returned it inside, and shut the clock. If you're still with me, leave a comment with the number 1. It lets me know you're still here. The months that followed were an exercise in patience I didn't realize I possessed. Marcus continued his efforts. Robert improved the legal safeguards. I observed Courtney the way I observe a clock with an occasional malfunction, knowing the issue exists, awaiting the instant it emerges clearly enough to handle. What I noticed over time was how she was influencing Daniel. She had not instructed him outright to separate from me. She was cleverer than that. Instead, she had sown notions. She remarked once that I appeared a bit domineering about the shop. She proposed another time that Daniel's tight bond with me made it difficult for them to establish their own character as a pair. She referenced Miriam in ways intended to console, but actually kept Daniel subdued. Gentle remarks about how difficult it must be to feel like he couldn't live up to his mother's remembrance, how perhaps he romanticized the past. None of this was directed at me personally. I learned it from Daniel himself in pieces over months of cautious discussion. He would utter something slightly off, a perspective I didn't recognize, a pause where there hadn't been one earlier, and I would record it, page after page in the green notebook. Not to assemble a case against my son, but to note that someone else was gradually reshaping him. In September, 14 months into the marriage, Daniel phoned me on a Tuesday evening. His voice was even in a manner that indicated he'd been practicing. "Dad, I think we should discuss the shop. I told him to come in the next morning." He sat across from me at the workbench the same way he had since he was a teenager, observing me labor, his elbows on the edge, hands clasped. He appeared weary. He'd shed weight. "Courtney believes it might be time to begin considering your retirement," he said. "She says you're not growing any younger, and the shop is a lot for one individual. And with property values where they are on Lexington, Daniel." I said, "Stop. Don't repeat what she instructed you to repeat. Speak to me." He remained silent for a long while. Then his jaw clenched. "She says the shop is occupying an asset we're not employing. The shop is your mother's heritage. I know that. Do you?" He raised his eyes to me, and for just a moment, I saw my son behind whatever Courtney had been constructing over the past year. Doubtful, a little embarrassed, grasping for something he couldn't identify. "Dad, I don't want to lose the shop," he said softly. She makes things sound so logical. And then I don't know what I truly believe anymore." I leaned forward. "Then I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen without returning home and discussing it tonight. Can you do that?" He nodded. "There are matters occurring around this shop that you don't know about. I'm not prepared to tell you everything yet because I need a little more time. But I need you to trust me the way your mother trusted me. Can you do that?" He gazed at me for a long time. "Is Courtney involved? Give me 3 more weeks." He didn't care for it, but he nodded. Those 3 weeks were when everything aligned. Marcus secured the proof I required. A recorded phone conversation between Courtney and Paige Hensley, in which the Lexington Avenue property was discussed as a sale-ready asset dependent only on what Courtney described as the timing of transfer. In that same call, Courtney mentioned that my blood pressure medication had been a subject of discussion with her contact at the insurance office and that she was monitoring things. She was following my health through my insurance. She had a contact inside the office, a woman she'd known from a prior real estate deal, who had granted her access to information that was not hers to share. Robert and Marcus both stated the same thing. "This was actionable," I said. "Not yet." One more thing. The final element came from Gloria. On a Thursday afternoon, while I was at a client's residence performing an on-site assessment, Courtney entered the shop. She told Gloria she was collecting something for Daniel. Gloria said she'd need to remain in the front. Courtney agreed, then requested to use the restroom, which is in the rear. Gloria guided her through. Courtney did not return for 14 minutes. This time, I had placed a small camera above the workbench the week prior. I reviewed the recording that evening. Courtney had proceeded straight to my filing cabinet. She had opened the second drawer, located the insurance file, and photographed 3 pages. Then she had stood at my workbench and examined the bracket clock for nearly 30 seconds. She lifted it, flipped it over, placed it back down. She did not discover the concealed bottom. That was the instant I phoned Robert and said, "It's time." I made the call to Daniel on a Friday morning. I told him I wanted a dinner, the 3 of us, at the Montford Rooftop, a restaurant we'd visited twice as a family for significant events. Private table. I told him I had something to disclose about the future of the shop, about everything. He phoned me back an hour later. Courtney had inquired what the occasion was. He said I'd told him estate planning. She had told him she thought that was excellent, and she would anticipate it. I told him the dinner was in 6 days. He said Courtney seemed eager. I told him to trust me. The morning of the dinner, I sat with Robert Ashford at his office on Charlotte Street. We examined everything we had arranged, the revised will, the trust conditions, the legal records of Courtney's meetings with Paige Hensley, the recorded call, Marcus's complete written summary. Robert had also arranged with a lawyer associate who had consented to be present at the restaurant, seated at the bar, available if the circumstance demanded legal observation. I asked Robert one question before I departed. Was everything prepared? He looked across the desk at me, the way people look when they want to say yes, but need it to signify something. "Everything," he said, "is precisely where it must be." I returned to the shop, opened the clock one final time, removed Miriam's letter, and read it slowly. Then I folded it into my inside jacket pocket. I was not going to share it openly. It belonged to me, but I wanted her close to me that night. At 7, I entered the Montford in my gray suit with the bracket clock wrapped in canvas under my arm. Daniel was already at the table, silent and upright. Courtney was across from him, attired elegantly, the image of a woman who had arrived to receive positive news. She smiled when I sat down, warm, rehearsed. "Arthur," she said, "this is such a splendid notion. It's so vital to get matters arranged." "It is," I said. That's precisely why we're here. We ordered, engaged in light conversation. Daniel observed me the way people observe a physician who has instructed them to await the outcomes. Courtney ordered a glass of champagne. When the main course was removed, I placed the clock on the table between us. Courtney looked at it. "Is that Miriam's clock?" "It is," I said. "She restored it herself the year before she passed. She requested I keep it at the shop. She told me I'd recognize when the moment arrived to employ it." Courtney laughed gently. "That's charming, so sentimental. There's something inside it." I said, "My wife was a meticulous woman. She noticed things others overlooked, and she readied for them. She left me a letter in a concealed section she constructed herself." The smile on Courtney's face altered slightly. "Not much, just enough." I opened the case, released the concealed bottom, and placed Miriam's letter on the table. I did not read it aloud. That was not for the table. Instead, I placed beside it a printed copy of Marcus's summary, the meetings with Paige Hensley, the insurance records, the recorded call. "Courtney," I said, "this is a document you should examine closely. My lawyer has a complete copy, so does the insurance commission." Daniel looked at the papers. His face became motionless. I kept my voice steady. "You have been meeting with a real estate lawyer to organize the sale of my property. You have been accessing my health insurance records without my approval. You told your lawyer that you were monitoring for a transfer of timing, and 2 weeks ago you entered my shop while I was absent and photographed documents from my private files." Courtney set down her glass. "Arthur, I think you've misinterpreted." "I have not misinterpreted anything. These are out of context. I was only—" "Courtney." Daniel's voice was quiet, decisive. She turned to him. "Don't," he said. The silence at that table was the loudest thing I have heard in 64 years. Robert's associate at the bar caught my eye briefly. I gave him a small nod. He returned to his drink. Courtney's poise broke apart piece by piece, the way aged glasswork fractured gradually, then all at once. She said things, excuses, partial truths, a version of events where her motives had been positive and her actions had been misinterpreted. Daniel said almost nothing. He looked at the papers. He looked at me. He looked at his wife with the expression of a man reading a map for a location he thought he knew and finding all the paths have altered. When Courtney rose to depart, I said one more thing. "The shop is not a deal. It is your mother's labor and mine, and it will transfer to individuals who treat it that way. My lawyer will contact yours next week." She left. The door of the restaurant shut behind her. Daniel and I sat in the silence for a while. "How long?" he finally said. 18 months. He looked at his hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed you to be able to face her without knowing, and because I needed time to be sure." "You were shielding me." "I was shielding your mother's work, and yes, you." He was silent for a long time. Then, the clock. "She left a letter inside the clock 8 years ago." He pressed his hand flat against the table, steadying himself. "She knew. She suspected. She wasn't certain, but she readied." Daniel looked at the bracket clock sitting in the middle of the table, fruitwood case and brass dial and Roman numerals, still marking time the way it had been constructed to do. "She was always 3 steps ahead of everything," he said softly. "She was," I said. "That's who she was." We sat there for an hour. We didn't converse much. Eventually, we walked out together into the Asheville night, downtown illuminated in the relaxed way it becomes in autumn, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before we headed to our separate cars. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "You don't have anything to be sorry for." He allowed her. "You trusted your wife. That's not a mistake. That's simply love." He nodded. I gripped his shoulder. He placed his hand over mine briefly, the way his mother used to. Then we said goodnight. I drove back to the shop, parked in the alley, took the bracket clock inside, and placed it back on the shelf above the workbench where Miriam had positioned it 8 years ago. I wound it because it had been stationary since I'd lifted it from the shop, and I let it start once more. I stood in the rear area listening to it tick. In the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings advanced the way legal proceedings do, gradually and without spectacle. Courtney's contact at the insurance office was reported and subsequently dismissed. Paige Hensley's firm sent a letter stating they were withdrawing from any deal related to the Lexington property. The records Marcus had collected were detailed enough that no additional action was necessary. Everyone simply withdrew and allowed the matter to fade. Daniel filed for divorce in November. He told me Courtney had agreed not to oppose it, which was the first sincere exchange they'd had in longer than he could recall. He moved back into the modest house he'd possessed before the marriage, on a peaceful street, not distant from the shop. He started returning on Sunday mornings. The first Sunday, he appeared with coffee and a bag of baked goods from a bakery on Haywood, and stood at the front counter the way he used to stand when he was 15. I didn't say anything. I simply unlocked the door and allowed him in. We didn't discuss Courtney. We discussed a cuckoo clock someone had delivered from a family estate that was going to require me the better part of a month to take apart. We discussed the weather and a film he'd watched. We talked the way fathers and sons talk when they're rediscovering the rhythm of each other after separation. 2 weeks later, I instructed him how to clean a mechanism for the first time. He wasn't naturally skilled at it. He was too hasty, the way engineers are always attempting to resolve when the task is to comprehend first. But he sat at the bench beside me for 2 hours without his phone, learning to be patient with something minor and exact, and I watched him become a little more like himself with every cautious turn of the screwdriver. At the end of the afternoon, he looked at the completed mechanism, clean and prepared, and said, "Mom did this. She did. She was skilled at it. She was better than me. Don't tell anyone." He smiled for the first time in what felt like a very long time. I want to tell you something about what this entire experience taught me, because I didn't endure 18 months of documentation and preparation merely to have a tale. I endured it because the things Miriam and I constructed together were worth safeguarding, not for their monetary worth, for what they signify, for what they stand for the reality that somewhere in this building is 38 years of 2 people appearing and valuing the labor. Greed doesn't declare itself. It arrives courteously, poses logical questions, and makes you feel silly for observing. The individuals who love you for what you possess rather than who you are will always discover a method to make their interest resemble care. They'll inquire about your health. They'll discuss the future. They'll label your life's work a number and wait for you to begin believing them. Don't allow them. Watch for the indicators. Maintain your own notes. Trust the people who appear without an agenda and love you without computation. And if you have a lawyer, keep them near because the optimal time to establish protection is before you require it. My name is Arthur Calloway. I'm 64 years old. I mend broken clocks and watches, and occasionally, when I'm very fortunate, I help keep a family intact. Miriam left me a clock with a secret inside and told me I'd recognize when the moment arrived. She was correct. She was always correct. The bracket clock is still above my bench. It operates beautifully now. Miriam's restoration was, as always, perfect. I wind it every Sunday morning before Daniel arrives, and I listen to it tick, steady and sure, marking every hour we still have together. Some mechanisms, once properly tended, will operate for a very long time. If this story meant something to you, leave a 2 in the comments so I know you stayed with me through the entire thing. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them. Some messages find the people who need them most. Thanks for watching my video.